All right, AP Human Geography students, welcome to one more lecture on cities and urban land use. This lecture is going to be covering several different models that are used to look at a couple different features of cities and urban land use throughout various countries, right? And particularly to describe the distribution of those cities throughout a given country or region. So let's jump into it. We're going to talk about the rank size rule, about primate cities and where you might find them, why you find them, central place theory or Kristallers theory, and we'll finish up by looking briefly at the gravity model, which will be a little bit of review for us, honestly, because we've talked about it before. Starting with the rank size rule. The basic idea of the rank size rule is that for the most part in an MDC, in a relatively developed country, you're going to see a ranking in the hierarchy or the size of those cities according to the rank size rule formula, okay? And it says that the nth largest settlement in a region will be 1n, the population of the largest settlement in the region. All right. What that means is, let's say we're talking about the 7th largest settlement, right? The 7th largest settlement in a region would be 1/7 the size of the largest. That's the rank size rule. A couple different guys have talked about something like this. One of the most closely associated with this rule is George Zipf, who in 1941 kind of creates this formula. So I bring that up because sometimes you might see this referred to as Zipf's law, in addition to the rank size rule. And the thing to keep in mind is that this has to do a little bit more with development sometimes, right? The ability of a country to sort of sustain a bunch of relatively large cities, right? With infrastructure and food and government care and all the different things that are going to go into keeping a bunch of, large size cities throughout your country, right? As opposed to just one or two, like we'll see in some of the other models we talk about. So this is something that is going to apply more to MDCs or relatively developed countries than it is to LDCs. The rank size rule makes a couple predictions. One being that essentially there's going to be a relationship between the amount of settlements that you find of different sizes and that the smallest settlements will always kind of be more numerous, all right? Or another way to kind of think of it is that the more people there are in a city, the greater the population, the fewer of those cities you're going to find in a given region. The less people in a city, the greater amount there will be of those cities, all right? And we'll kind of build on that a little bit as we continue talking here. But that's the basic kind of prediction of rank size rule, that you're going to see a descending kind of hierarchy of cities as you kind of move down population, right? With there being more and more as you get to the smaller and smaller settlements. This is from your textbook showing basically, two examples of the rank size rule, right? Where you can see with the United States, the, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 50 largest cities kind of arrayed along this graph here. And for the most part, the United States follows it pretty closely. To a lesser degree, Mexico, although Mexico, we would say, has a little bit of a gap there, right? Looks like their largest city, probably Mexico City, is significantly larger than the next largest city, which looks like, it has a population just under 5 million. So you'd say probably not as good of a candidate for the rank size rule. What we would expect is that you would have, both the United States and Mexico have large cities of about 20 million people, New York or Mexico City. And then rank size rule predicts the next largest city should be about half that, right? The second ranked city should be about 1/2 the size of the first largest city. So you'd expect to see a city of about 10 million or something, around there. And that's not really what we see, right? We see this big drop off from Mexico, although the United States kind of follows this pretty smooth line as it descends through the ranks of its cities. A couple other examples. I mean, this is how you'll kind of typically see it displayed if you end up with questions where there's a stimulus for this, right? Is to kind of look at these examples and see, like, is the United States a good example of the rank size rule? Is Indonesia a good example of the rank size rule? Well, maybe not, right? New Zealand and Australia, you can see both follow it pretty closely. This is normally how it's going to be shown, kind of along a graph that looks very similar to all of these, right? All right, but in addition to the rank size rule, there is the idea of primacy and primate cities, okay? Primacy refers to the degree to which a single city is going to be the focus of a nation's economy, government, and growth. And as we talk about this, we'll see that often the existence of kind of primacy in a region, in a country, can typically or often be the result of unplanned development or really rapid growth where one place gets this extra focus, right? Or draws the attention of the population as a center for migration and urbanization. A primate city is related to this idea of primacy, okay? A primate city is defined as the largest settlement in a country if it is more than twice as many people as the second ranked settlement, all right? So kind of if it doesn't follow the rank size rule, right? If your largest settlement is 10 million people and then your next largest settlement is only 2 million people, so that doesn't really follow the rank size rule very well, but it is a good candidate for that to be considered probably a primate city. In addition to being the largest settlement, you're typically going to find that this primate city usually is also the financial, political, and population center of a country. A good example might be Paris, France, where you have a similar situation to that. Where, for example, I think Paris has a population somewhere around 12 million, and the next largest city in France is going to be Lyon, where the population is a little above 2 million, right? So a significant drop-off, not something that follows the rank size rule. We would say Paris is a very good example of a primate city. Just in case it comes up, one thing that you might see is from time to time, you will have regions or countries where there are two very large cities of almost equal population within the same region, and then a big drop-off to like the third largest city, right? But you might have two very big cities, and then the third city is, less than half the size of each of those, or something like that. When that happens, that's called binary primacy or binary distribution. A good example might be India, where the cities of Mumbai and Delhi, with Delhi usually having 16.5 million is what you'll see a lot, and Mumbai being similar, about 17, 18 million people, but pretty close, right? Where you don't see that big drop-off. We would refer to that as binary primacy or a binary distribution. Finally, a primate city is often going to be the capital city, like Paris, for example, but not always. That won't always be the case, okay? But it's a safe assumption a lot of it. So why are there primate cities is what we want to try and understand here. Well, there's a lot of reasons that might go into it, just like there's sort of a lot of reasons a region might follow the rank size rule. Typically, there's a couple things we can try to point out with primate cities. It might be the size of the country. Typically, smaller countries are more likely candidates for primate cities because, similar to the rank size rule, it's kind of the opposite in that they're unlikely to have the infrastructure, the population, and so on that can support a bunch of large cities distributed throughout the region. A lot of times countries with a colonial history where they were, a subject or victim of imperialism in the past, are going to be more likely to have a primate city where the wealth and the development of that colony was concentrated into a single sort of colonial city, a kind of colonial capital in that area. The resources that were extracted from that colony would likely be traveling through this one spot that acted as a kind of transportation hub, a center of administrative control, and a center of communication and transportation, a kind of port or things like that, that would have been the center of this kind of colonial government. Countries with a strong monarchy, currently or one in their past. So again, you can think of like London in England or Paris, France, that used to be the seats of these monarchies. There's still a queen in England, and that throughout their history has attracted, greater concentrations of people and power and investment in that capital city, and grown it, to a larger degree than other places in the region. Export-oriented economies, places like Singapore, that are very focused maybe around a particular port that a lot of goods are coming in and out of as the center of their economy, might be good candidates for primate cities, although Singapore is almost like a city-state, really in its own right. But places with a strong central government or a unitary state in particular, where you're not going to have sort of power distributed through a bunch of municipal or like state level, provincial level capitals, all that, sort of government power and infrastructure is going to be concentrated in this one spot for the most part in a unitary state. Again, think of, Paris or something. And then last, in areas where you see a lot of industrial or commercial agglomeration, right? These very, more developed or industrial focused parts of a country might attract, a disproportionate amount of workers and population into that place for opportunities and convenience. And then in places that are, experiencing demographic transition, right? Places that are, surging through stage 2 or the early parts of stage 3 of the demographic transition model. This is one of the things we kind of predict to see, right? Is massive rural to urban migration in these LDCs that are experiencing demographic transition, where you're going to maybe have one of these capitals or large cities that might match with several other things on this list that might be some old colonial capital or the seat of a monarchy or government or whatever, but especially in LDCs that are experiencing lots of rural to urban migration, it wouldn't be unusual for one of those cities to gain some deal of primacy. So what are the benefits to a primate city? There are a couple. One being that the agglomeration of all that power and industry and commerce is convenient as far as foreign direct investment goes, right? Other corporations, countries looking to invest in that region, there's an obvious and ideal candidate, right, for that investment. And it's probably going to be that city that has primacy, which will only sort of reinforce the primacy of that city, really. The idea being eventually that investment's going to, eventually maybe trickle down or benefit the larger parts of the country. Additionally, primate cities can be attractive destinations of migration. Again, if you kind of think about these LDCs that might be experiencing demographic transition and lots of rural to urban migration, it's going to be these spots where there's going to be the most resources, the greatest amount of services and kind of larger threshold, larger range services, where the infrastructure is going to be the most developed on a large scale. All of that is going to be kind of more attractive for migrants and people looking for a new home. The negatives can be kind of obvious here. Housing shortages as there's, increased competition, this one sort of urban center that everybody's flocking to. Traffic congestion, especially if, as often happens, this growth is kind of unplanned, unpredicted, happens really quickly as a part of a population surge, and the roads aren't as well built out, the rail isn't efficiently laid out, things like that. Traffic can be a big problem. As with like lots of urban concentrations, especially where you see lots of inequality, you might have big problems with crime in any large city, really, but maybe more so in these primate cities. Pollution from traffic, from people littering, from just the accumulation of waste. The difference sort of between the lifestyles in general, between kind of the urban residents of your country and the rural residents, is going to be only accentuated, right? Only exaggerated by the existence of a primate city, right? Where you have this one place that kind of stands in stark contrast to the rural areas of your country versus, again, you think someplace like the United States that has lots of very, well-developed urban concentrations that, leave it without that, really stark here's this one kind of New York, really nice place, and then, a bunch of small rural country towns otherwise. That inequality is a little extra kind of highlighted in places with primacy. Downside is that these primate cities might, as they are the centers of government, of power, of the economy and things like that, they might receive a kind of undue concentration of power and energy supplies and other forms of infrastructure to the neglect of other parts of the country. There can be an increase in almost assuredly in land value or the cost at a certain city location compared to the rest of the country, right? The cost of living, the cost of rent and things like that, of owning a home in one of these large cities, is going to be much more expensive than the surrounding kind of hinterland and the rest of the country. Bangkok in Thailand is a really good example, and I forget exactly where I dug this up from, some paper from a university somewhere. I forget exactly where, but this kind of gives you some details that you might see in a typical kind of primate city country. All right, the kinds of concentrations of infrastructure and power and commerce and stuff that I've been suggesting here. Look at some of these statistics here, right? So approximately 70% of Thailand's urban population now live in Bangkok, and 10% of the country's total population is concentrated in that one city, right? But 70% of the urban population, right, of everybody living in cities, most of them are in that one spot. Bangkok has a disproportionate share of other development indices, such as 79% of all the pharmacists in Thailand, 45% of all doctors, 80% of the country's telephones, 72% of all registered passenger cars, basically. And it accounts for 60% of the country's GDP, all right? Bangkok is an excellent example of a primate city. This is another kind of visual display, and this is an extra, almost exaggerated example here, where you've got this one place that's really significantly larger than anything that comes next. You might see less of a stark contrast here oftentimes. Really, just any time that largest city is more than twice the size of the next largest city, that's enough to really qualify it as a primate city. All right, next is one of the major models or theories for cities and urban land use unit, central place theory, okay? This is also sometimes known as Christahler's theory, after Walter Christahler, the German geographer that kind of first laid this out in the 30s. Central place theory is a geographical theory that seeks to explain the number, size, and location of human settlements in an urban system. All right? The idea here is that cities often exist not in isolation really, but as parts of an urban system. An urban system is like an interdependent set of cities in a region that share consumers, population, and services. Central place theory is all about explaining and predicting the number, size, and location of settlements within that urban system. All right, and once we see some visuals, that will really help a little bit. A central place is a place where people go for goods and services. Okay, it could be a tiny community like a hamlet with a convenience store and a post office, maybe some worship center, or it could be a larger town, some smaller city with more stores and services, or major cities where the greatest of services could be found, right? Like where people might go to get a heart transplant, or where you could go get a direct flight to some other major city, right? These are central places where goods and services are provided. A central place is surrounded by a market area, all right? A market area that surrounds each central place shows the boundaries where the central place provides goods and services and the limit from where it's drawing its customers or population from. One of the ways central place and market areas can be used is in determining the optimal location for a service, right? The most profitable spot, sort of, where a service could be located. And we'll look at that in a little bit as well. One of the basic components, one of the main ideas here, the whole thing central place theory is really trying to do and show is that larger settlements are going to be fewer and farther apart than smaller settlements, and are going to be providing services for larger numbers of people, a higher threshold, or services people are willing to travel farther for, a range, and that you're going to find a network of these settlements. Lots of small ones, fewer bigger ones, and then very few really, really big ones, okay? But that they're going to work together to sort of share services and customers. Walter Gustaller chose to show these central places and these market areas as hexagons when he drew these things on maps, right? Instead of using circles where you would get a lot of overlapping areas and big gaps in between them, showing some areas with no services, some areas with overlapping services, which in a weird way might not be a terrible way to show it. Or using squares where the people that would be located in the corners would be the farthest away from these, central dots, which would be the settlement, right, where the, services are coming from. Hexagons are a good compromise, right? Somewhere in between a circle and a square where everything will sort of nest together nice and well, fit up, up against each other really neatly, and not have big gaps or overlaps. So one of the key parts of central place theory is the idea of a market area. A market area, once again, is the area sort of surrounding a central place from which people are attracted to use that central place's goods and services. And the way that a market area is going to be determined is by taking into account the range and threshold of that service, okay? The range of a threshold is considered to be the maximum distance people are willing to travel for a service. Now, people might travel very far for certain services, right? It may be a diamond wedding ring, a heart transplant, a flight to another continent or something, right? You might be willing to drive some distance for something like that. There are other services like fast food or toothpaste, shampoo or something that you're not going to be willing to travel a great distance for, right? You're not going to drive to Los Angeles to go to a McDonald's, You'll just drive to the closest McDonald's, right? The only other thing I'd say about range is that sometimes you might see it expressed more as a measure of time than as a distance, right? People willing to drive 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or something like that. Threshold refers to the minimum number of people needed to support a service. So you might have services that have a very low threshold, a convenience store or a gas station, someplace that doesn't need thousands and thousands and thousands of customers to stay in business or open. Restaurants, hospitals, high schools, department stores all have kind of higher thresholds. They do require thousands of people to sort of stay in business, right? Think about how many families are connected to a local high school. The largest market areas are going to be for services that depend on huge populations, right? A stock market exchange, a major sports team that needs to fill a stadium or arena, right? Symphony orchestras, elite research centers. You're only going to find these in the largest kind of central places or market areas, right? These very high range, high threshold services. One way that this can be determined, a threshold for an area, might be by using census data to determine like the amount of potential customers in a market area, especially when you keep in mind that not every service is going to apply to everyone in a given population, right? That only certain ages or income groups, marital status might really be counted as the primary customers of a certain service, right? Another thing to keep in mind is that to kind of refer back to older units, market areas are going to be really good examples of functional regions or a nodal region, right? It's going to be a central place with a range, right? This extending range around it where the desire to use a certain service is going to diminish the farther away you get from that central point, right? That's a great example of a functional or a nodal region. Okay, so one of the ways that the business world might use some of these ideas is by determining something like optimal market location, right? Is when you start to combine these ideas of a central place and range and threshold and the market area all together to try and determine, what would be the best place for my pizza shop or pizzeria, right? In this case, you would start by kind of calculating the range. How far are people willing to sort of drive or travel for this service that I'm providing? Let's say, people will go 10 miles, for a pizza, and then beyond that, they'll kind of settle for whatever's the best pizza within that 10 miles, right? Then you calculate the threshold. How much people do we need to be buying pizzas to make a profit, enough to sort of pay our rent and stay in business, right? So if you need, $5,000 a week on average to pay your employees, to pay rent, to buy the supplies, to make the pizza, people spend an average of, $5 a week. That'd be a great price for a pizza. You would say, well, the threshold is I need like 1,000 customers a week, right? That's kind of what I need. And then you'd try to determine the market area. You're going to be looking for a 10-mile range, right? This kind of 10-mile circle or hexagon, really, around your pizzeria, and trying to see if there are 1,000 people or so within that 10-mile market area that will use your service, right? If you do have that in abundance, then you should be good, right? That would be the optimal location for your market. If you find out that there's, nowhere close to 1,000 people that have that kind of disposable income or that are, able to travel that far or whatever, then that's not going to be the optimal location, right? So this does have kind of real world applications. This is sort of another way you can kind of visualize central place theory. One of its ideas about the distribution of settlements is how you see the settlements kind of distributed around North Dakota here, right? Where you've got this central place, this city of I'm not 100% sure how to pronounce that really, Mino. And then you can see less numerous small towns scattered around, like Burlington or Surrey or Velva or Garrison or Newtown or Stanley, or these ones that you see. And then slightly more numerous villages like Mohall or Glenburn or Upham or Granville or Sawyer or whatever. And then lots and lots of these kind of hamlets, these very small communities, Donnybrook, Tawley, Grano, Karlsruhe, Balta, Benedict, right? And that's the basic idea of central place theory, is that you're going to have one central place with the highest range, highest threshold services that all these communities from the surrounding area are going to treat as their central place for those services. And then scattered around are going to be slightly smaller communities from which you will find services with smaller ranges and thresholds that smaller communities are going to use as their central places, so on and so on down the ladder. When you are able to visualize it as hexagons, like is shown here, you can see this kind of nesting of smaller settlements within the market areas of larger settlements, so on, up to these large cities, right? So take a minute to examine what you're looking at here. You have this central place of a large city with a hexagon drawn around it, showing the kind of range and threshold for the large-scale services that you might find in that city. The stadium, the museum, the research center, the things like we mentioned, right? The diamond jeweler. And then you see in the kind of orange areas, right, these hexagons drawn around these other towns, these kind of larger towns, right, that create central places for the villages and hamlets around them, all of which are dependent on these distributed cities, right? What you don't see is 2 or 3 cities clustered right next to each other, right? Because they will not have the populations to support the range and threshold of those services, right? They need to be distributed in such a way that the population is there to support services in the right amounts, right? This is the kind of original drawing of Walter Christaller looking across southern Germany, where you can see in large part he's kind of drawing circles here, and in a lot of cases these circles are overlapping with the market areas of other places. But when you can zoom out a little bit, you can start to see these large cities do kind of form these hexagonal connections with the other large cities, and have all kinds of smaller cities with other, shorter range, lower threshold services scattered between them, right? But this is kind of the original depiction Walter Christaller included in his early essays on the topic. Finally, we have the gravity model, which is potentially one of the simpler models to kind of understand and visualize. The gravity model attempts to predict the interaction between population centers or central places or cities, basically, all right? And what it says is the gravity model says that places that are larger and closer together will have a greater interaction than places that are smaller and farther apart from each other, all right? That the more amount of people in 2 cities, the more interaction you can kind of predict between them, and that the farther people must travel, the less interaction you're going to see between them. The closer those cities are together, the more interaction you'll see between them, right? The way that you calculate this, and the reason it's called the gravity model, is very similar to like trying to determine the force of gravity between 2 objects in physics, right? Except instead of comparing the mass of 2 things, you're going to be comparing the population of 2 cities. So the gravity model is almost overly simple, right? Interaction is proportional to the multiplication of the 2 populations divided by the distance between them, all right? So You have population of one city, Los Angeles or whatever, population of another city, New York or whatever, divided by the distance between them, whatever that would be squared, right? 2,500 miles squared or something. And that's going to give you some raw number that's really only useful if you compare it to some other number that you derive from the gravity model, right? To kind of compare the amount of predicted interactions between two given cities or central places or population centers, all right? Now, interaction between cities can be complicated by some things other than size and distance, right? So places like, Las Vegas, Nevada, or Orlando, Florida, Miami, something like that, are tourist destinations, right, that attract a lot more visitors than their size or their distance from other cities might predict, right? People travel to Las Vegas from all over the world because of a bunch of other characteristics we have besides just how close we are or the population, right? Jerusalem or Mecca, these religious sites, right, attract people from all over the world way out of place with their distance to those places or their population size. Government centers like Washington, D.C., cultural destinations, etc. All those things kind of distort the predictions of the gravity model. But for the most part, in most cases, the basic theory is going to apply. That two places with very large populations are going to see more interaction, or places with a shorter distance between them are going to see more interaction, is the basic idea of the gravity model. All right, so that wraps it up. Those are the major models of our cities and urban land use unit. I hope that helps you. Talk to you guys again real soon about some of this stuff.